right, so this is lesson 10. There are 2 lessons left in this section, this one and another one about blood. In this section, we're going to be talking really exclusively about red blood cells and how they work. And in conjunction with red blood cells, we are going to talk about how you know what blood type somebody is, what type of blood they could receive, who they could donate blood to, all that kind of stuff. In your textbook, this is section 8.2 mostly. Some of it is actually in section 8.3 when we talk about who can give blood to who. But most of the stuff about red blood cells is in section 8.2. So the first thing that we need to talk about when we talk about blood is what is your blood made up of? Now on this screen I have a picture of a little test tube. I like that. I would use that. I would use it in a question. I would ask you what each layer was. I might even show you a test tube with layers that didn't look like that and ask you what is wrong with this person. So it would be worth your while to draw a little test tube. Now, just to show you, even I can draw a test tube, so it's doable. Now, a normal, average, healthy person's blood should be composed of basically 2 sections. The top section, which is a little more than half, so 55%. So that would be this part here, is made up of plasma. The bottom part, which is the other 45%, is made up of 2 different kinds of cells. So if I take a look first at plasma, it's important that you recognize what plasma is made out of. So this top portion here is plasma. That is where things can be dissolved in your blood because most of that plasma is water. So anything that could be dissolved in your blood, maybe it is a nutrient, maybe it is a waste, maybe it is a gas, maybe it's a hormone, maybe it's a protein. Anything that your blood can transport that's not somehow attached to one of your blood cells would be found in plasma. The other 45%, so a little bit less than half of your blood, is made up of cells. But there are 2 kinds: white blood cells and red blood cells. Now notice how the layer of white blood cells separates red blood cells from the plasma of your blood. This isn't how your blood looks naturally. When your blood is in you, everything is all kind of mixed together. This is what your blood looks like if we were to take a sample of it and let it settle and let it separate. The cells go to the bottom and the plasma goes to the top. The white blood cells form a little layer in between the plasma and the red blood cells. So of this 45%, 1% of it is white blood cells, and the other 44% approximately is red blood cells. Now that's what it looks like normally. There are conditions where a person doesn't have this proportion. For example, if a person had an infection, their white blood cells would take up more of the space. If a person had, say, anemia, which is where you have less iron and thus less red blood cells, their red blood cells might take up a smaller portion of it. So this is the average amount. If those amounts change, then whatever is being transported by that portion of the blood is also going to be affected. So I'm just going to put a little note here because we'll talk about it. White blood cells really have the most to do with immunity. Red blood cells have a lot to do with oxygen and oxygen transport. So we already saw that hemoglobin, part of your red blood cells, we saw it in the chapter on respiration. I'm not saying that red blood cells don't do anything else, but one of their main things is transporting oxygen. The plasma I already noted over here, is where everything else is transported. Now, since the plasma is mostly water, that should be the focus. So I could, if I was a clever person, ask you questions about blood that actually have to do with one of the other chapters. For example, if a person had less plasma in their blood than normal, it might mean that they're dehydrated. And then you could talk about your kidneys and maybe something that happened there to make the person be dehydrated. So there's a link between your blood and a bunch of these other chapters we've already discussed because they might affect the amount that there is of each of these things. Does anybody want to ask anything about this? It would make a really good, say, like written question. I show you a person's test tube of blood and ask you what on earth could be wrong with them. Or like the first physiology written part where you had a normal person and then 3 test subjects that were all different. That would make an excellent question there. Really excellent question. So we're going to talk first about red blood cells. Red blood cells are called erythrocytes. That literally means red cells. That is what the word means. Erythro means red, cyte means cell. So it's a fancy name, it's a fancy word, because scientists like to be fancy. But all we're doing is taking Greek or Latin-based parts of words, making a fancy science word out of it. So your erythrocytes, or red cells, have some characteristics. First of all, where are they formed? In your bone marrow. That's something that I find that maybe people are unaware of. They think that blood and bones don't have a lot to do with each other. If you have ever heard of someone needing or getting or donating bone marrow, this would be why. You're not donating bone marrow because of a bone problem usually, you're donating it because of a blood problem. So, bone marrow is in the center of your bones. So if you've ever, I have a dog, and there's these little treats called marrow bones that you can give them, and it looks white on the outside and red on the inside. It's, of course, just like some manufactured little thing. It's not an actual piece of bone, but they are mimicking the fact that there's blood on the inside of your bones. Red blood cells have no nucleus. And I'm going to highlight that because that makes them different than other types of blood cells. Now, why would they not have a nucleus? Well, when you're part of a multicellular organism and you do not have to accomplish all of the vital functions yourself, sometimes you don't need all of the parts of the cell. So since red blood cells are not particularly concerned with expression of genetic code necessarily, they don't need a nucleus to control them because they're part of a big organism that has controls already. They live about 120 days. So if there are about 30 days in a month, that means they live about 4 months. So every 4 months, you have a completely new set of blood cells. What happens when a blood cell has reached the end of its lifespan? Your spleen and your liver will break them down. Now your spleen you could theoretically live without. It's kind of like your gallbladder. It is accessory to a function that happens in more than one place. So a splenectomy, which would mean removing your spleen, that you would be able to survive that because your liver also plays a role here. Your liver ends up making bile out of part of what it broke down from a red blood cell. So bile, which comes from your liver, is made up of some pigments, and one of the pigments that is making bile is the result of breaking down a red blood cell. Now, once they're broken down, you would ingest a lot of the broken down pieces of them. Now your red blood cells contain hemoglobin. So we've already seen hemoglobin is a protein. Hemoglobin has iron in it. Iron attracts oxygen. So I'm just going to remind you, hemoglobin is sort of a 4-part protein. Each of the 4 sections has a little group that has iron as part of it. And because of that iron, oxygen is attracted to it. So we already saw that in the chapter on respiration, so we're just repeating this. Now the next point goes back to something we talked about in a previous lesson. Red blood cells stay in your blood vessel. They do not leave purposefully. They will only leave if your blood vessel is damaged. In other words, this represents a closed system. Red blood cells do not want to leave your blood vessels, ever. Now, what does a red blood cell look like? Usually it's described as looking like a bagel. I think there's actually a better analogy because a bagel has a hole in the middle, and a red blood cell doesn't have a hole in the middle. Have you ever seen a Campino candy? It's like a lifesaver, but it doesn't have a hole in the middle. It just has a dip in the middle. I think that that's actually a better analogy for a red blood cell, even though bagel is what you see very frequently. So when I look at a red blood cell from the side, it kind of looks like that, where it's flat in the middle and puffs out on the side. If I were to look at it from the top, it's not a hole in the center, but a dip that goes down in the center. So if I look at it from the side, it's fairly flat. If I look at it from the top, it looks like a lifesaver, but without a hole in the center, just a dip down. So this part here wouldn't be a hole, just a flattened portion. Now, red blood cells need to have this sort of flattened shape because they need to fit. Capillaries are quite small, and if red blood cells were like a big, wide, spherical shape, they wouldn't fit. So they have this squished, flattened shape, so they can squeeze through capillaries, but still have a ton of surface area. So this is not the first nor the second, but the third time I've specifically mentioned surface area. You need to have a lot of surface area so you can have efficient gas exchange. And your red blood cells maintain that. They're pretty flat and thin, which means they have lots of surface compared to the volume of the cell. Now this next point here is one that some people use to their advantage. If there is lower oxygen concentration in the air, your body responds. So I'm just going to put my old friend homeostasis down there. If the oxygen that you, or if the air that you are breathing has lower oxygen content, your body responds by making more red blood cells. So if you are spending prolonged periods, let's say at high altitudes, your body will realize that you're not breathing in as much oxygen and will respond by making more red blood cells. Now, high altitudes are not the only place that you could have low oxygen content in the air. It would just be the most typical, normal way that a person would encounter this situation. So perhaps you've heard of people doing this on purpose. Perhaps athletes, people that are trying to compete in some sort of physical endeavor. Denver is a really popular city for people to go to train. And the reason is, it's called the Mile High City for a reason. It is literally a mile above sea level, so it's very high in altitude. And the higher you go in altitude, the lower the oxygen content. So if I wanted to stimulate my body to naturally make more red blood cells and thus carry more oxygen, I could go train somewhere where there's a high altitude, then my body would make more red blood cells. So this would be a way to enhance your circulatory system to carry oxygen. Now, this isn't going to make you a better athlete. You still have to train, but now you have the capacity perhaps to carry more oxygen. The thing with homeostasis is that it's not instant. So once you leave the higher altitude, it would take a while for your body to realize, hey, I'm not at the high altitude anymore. And so you would have that higher level of red blood cells, at least for some period of time, after leaving the high altitude area. I know that I've seen people at the gym that I go to, you can buy like a, kind of looks like a weird Darth Vader mask that you strap over your face. And there's one guy in particular I can think of, he uses it all the time. It's an altitude training mask. So even though he's here where the altitude is not particularly high, he puts this mask on, and I'm not quite sure exactly how it works. I probably stare at him more than I should because it makes a weird sound and it looks weird. But he's training as though he were in a high altitude, even though he is here. Now, does anyone have any questions they want to ask about that? Homeostasis, good written response question, really, really good. Now, the next thing we have to talk about is blood type. This is the thing where there's a really good picture of it in your textbook. So if you haven't already printed out notes where there is a picture, if you wanted to find page 296 of your textbook, it's going to illustrate what the different blood types look like. Now there are 4 major blood types. Notice I use the word major because this is the typical way that we would classify someone's blood. There are other things that you could use to classify a person's blood. We are only going to talk about the ABO blood system, which is the most common one for humans to use to categorize their blood. And the reason that you would have a particular blood type depends on protein markers that are or are not present on your red blood cells. So what I'm going to show you is a little chart. Now, in the chart that I'm going to make, I have added the positive and the negative markers. Your textbook doesn't have this. Your textbook only has what is A, what is B, what is AB, and what is O. But since I'd like you to know what the positive and the negative mean as well, I extended my chart to have 8 things instead of just 4. So in addition to the 4 blood types, I'm showing you the positive and the negative for each one of them. So this chart, which is like the one on page 296 of your text, is going to indicate to you what you have if you have a particular blood type. Now, there are 2 types of proteins. There are antigens, which are on the surface of your red blood cell, and there are antibodies, which can be found in the plasma of your blood. So antigens are part of the cell section of your blood. Antibodies are part of the plasma section. Now, these aren't the only proteins in your blood, they're just the ones that help us determine blood type. If I have blood type A positive, on the surface of my red blood cell, I have A antigens. I also have what is called the rhesus factor. Rhesus, based on monkeys, where people figured this out. We normally abbreviate rhesus RH. So if I have blood type A positive, it means I have A proteins attached to the surface of my red blood cell, and I have the rhesus factor, the RH protein. What do I have in the plasma of my blood? I have antibodies. An antibody's job is to attack things. So I definitely don't have antibodies for the proteins I have. I should write it like this. I have anti-B. I don't have B on my red blood cells, so I have the antibodies to attack them. Now, if I have A negative blood, I have A antigens on the surface, and then in my plasma, I have anti-B and anti-RH. So if I have an antigen, I don't have an antibody for it. That would be silly. I would attack my own blood and I would die. If I don't have an antigen, then I do have the antibody for it. So we'll fill in the B's. If I'm B positive, I have B and I have RH on the surface of my red blood cells. And in my plasma, I would have anti-A. If I'm B negative, I still have the B, but this time I have anti-A and anti-RH. Now AB is next. If I'm blood type AB, that means I have A and B. If I'm positive, I also have the RH factor. In my plasma then, do I have antibodies for any of those blood antigens? I don't. I have none. Now, I'm using the word none kind of loosely here. I'm not saying you don't have any antibodies at all. What I mean is you don't have any antibodies for blood antigens. You probably have other antibodies that will help you kill flu viruses and other infections that you might get. You just don't have any of the blood antibodies. AB negative then would have A and B, not the RH factor, and they would have anti-RH antibodies. And then we get to type O. Type O is sort of a weird blood type because it's the absence of things that defines it. Type O positive has the RH factor. That's it. O blood doesn't have A and doesn't have B antigens. There isn't an O antigen for it to have. Type O blood is the absence of the other two. So in the plasma, this person would have anti-A and anti-B. O negative has nothing, no proteins on the surface of the red blood cell. It doesn't have A, it doesn't have B, and since it's negative, it doesn't have the RH factor. That means in the plasma, there would be anti-A, anti-B, and anti-RH. So this is what you have depending on the blood type you have. Now, do any of you know what blood type you are? Oh, good. Some of you actually do. I'm finding it increasingly abnormal for people to know what blood type they are. And it's a really, really good thing to know, especially if you have an unusual blood type. I would be willing to bet that 90% of you have type O blood because that is the most prevalent type of blood that most people have. In fact, O positive would be the type that more people have than any other type of blood. That's why type O blood is in such high demand. Lots of people have it, but it's also in high demand because lots of people can receive type O blood. There's nothing on it. And so even if you naturally have type A blood, type O blood has nothing on it for your blood to attack. If you happen to have type AB blood, you need to be pretty careful about who you would donate blood to. You can actually receive blood from anybody if you have type AB blood because you do not have antibodies that will attack blood present. But it's good to know. It's really, really good to know because if you happen to have type A blood and you are in an accident and they give you type B blood, you will probably die because the blood that's getting donated to you will react with the antibodies that you have. So if you don't know what blood type you are, you should find out. If your mom doesn't know, ask her to look. Sometimes it's on like the record of your birth. I know that for some reason I have no idea what blood type my child is, but I deduced what her blood type is based on what mine and my husband's are. We both have type O blood, so she kind of has to have type O blood. And if she doesn't, then I'll know they switched babies at the hospital on me. So The thing I want to show you next, there's a picture very much like this in your textbook, again on page 296, that's showing you a picture of what we just wrote down. So type A blood, if I look at the red blood cell, now is it actually the letter A in a circle on a stick? No, this is just graphic representation. But if you have type A blood, you have little proteins on the surface of your beautiful red Campino candy blood cell. And in the plasma, you have antibodies for B. Antibodies generally look like a little Y shape. That's kind of the basic structure for them. If you have blood type B, you have Bs on the surface of your red blood cells, and you have antibodies, these little Y-shaped things, for A. If you have type AB, you have both, and then there are none in your plasma. And if you have type O, you have nothing on the surface. So these two are pretty important. The fact that one of them has nothing on the surface, the fact that one of them does not have antibodies in the plasma. So this is just a picture representation of what we just saw. What we're going to do next is make another little chart that shows you who can give blood to who, so that you know how that would work. So this is blood type matching. Now, for simplicity's sake, I'm not going to put the positives and the negatives in this because it would make the chart incredibly wide and incredibly long. We're going to focus on the A and the B and the O. And then I put a little note at the bottom how the positive and negative affect each other. Now, if you look at this, I'm showing the recipient here. So these are the blood types of the person receiving the blood. The donor is here. And the way you determine if blood types match is that you consider the antibodies in the receiver's blood and the proteins, so the surface proteins, in the donor's blood. So normally when you donate blood, they actually separate blood into plasma and blood cells. So when you are getting donation, let's say, of blood cells, it's usually just the blood cells that you're getting, and the plasma is separate. If you watch doctor shows like I do, sometimes you'll hear them say, I have some pure, clean plasma that we're going to give the patient, and that's because the blood cells and the plasma are usually separate. So the first thing that you should know is if you have type A, of course, you can give blood to someone else who is type A. B can give to type B, AB can give to AB, and O can give to O. So it's a match. Anytime I put a check mark, it's a match. Now there are some other people who can give blood. Like I said previously, type O can realistically be given to anybody. So type O can donate to A. Type O can donate to B. Type O can donate to AB. The other thing I said was that type AB, since it has all the proteins, it doesn't have any of the antibodies to attack them. So type AB can receive blood from anybody. Now these are all of the matches. These are all the donations of blood that should work. If it does not work, we have a different word for it. The word down here is agglutination. Agglutination more or less means it's going to react to form a bunch of clumps. If type A is given to type B, that is bad, and you will get agglutination. If type A is given to O, bad, you will get agglutination. Everywhere else on the chart that we didn't say was a match will be agglutination. So you can see there's actually more check marks than there are X's. But the things that are causing X's are really, really important. You would not want to make a mistake with that. Now, since type O can be given to anybody, we would call type O the universal donor. Type AB blood, since it can receive any other type of blood, would be called the universal receiver. And then if we wanted to include the positive and the negative in this, I didn't because it would have made the chart really, really big. A person who is Rh negative cannot receive Rh positive blood. And that's the thing you have to remember. Positive cannot donate to negative, but the other way around is possible. So realistically, the universal donor would be O negative, and the universal receiver would be AB positive. Because AB positive really has no blood antibodies, and O negative has really no blood antigens. Now, does anyone have anything that they would like to ask about this?